Welcome to How You Livin', a transformative podcast featuring best-selling author, inspirational speaker, and minister, Dr. Rick Rigsby. And now, Dr. Rick.
Hello, friends. Thanks so much for listening. The most significant lesson taught to me by my father, the wisest man I ever met in my life, yet he was just a third grade dropout, was this: son, just stand. That's it. That's the lesson. Son, just stand. Friends, that lesson is profound in its simplicity and life-changing in its application. My dad taught me this lesson on the worst day of my life, the funeral of my first wife. Here's the scene. Me and my boys are standing in front of the casket of their mommy, my wife, in 1996. Trina had passed away following a 6-year battle with breast cancer. As we said our goodbyes, I looked at my dad and I said, "Dad, I've lost hope." My father simply said, "Son, you can't lose something God gave you. You haven't lost hope. You've lost perspective. Now, son, just stand." This episode is part 3 of our discussion to encourage all of us to continue standing. My father stood even when I could not. My father motivated me to go forward even when I didn't think that I could. So friends, here's my hope. Here's my prayer, that this simple charge from a third grade dropout will meet you right where you are today, regardless of what you may be going through, whether financial issues or relational problems or a health crisis or challenges on the job or uncertainty regarding your future. Regardless of the circumstances, despite the situation, this is what I'm discovering. The ultimate goal is, do you have the courage, the conviction, and the faith to keep standing, regardless of what you think, regardless of how you feel, regardless of what you see. That's what was taught to me by this third grade dropout. My dad was the son of sharecroppers, of farmers in East Texas. He grew up, being born in 1920, he grew up during the Jim Crow era of American history. As America breathed the last gasp of the Civil War, my father decided at an early age that he was going to be a man, not a black man, not a brown man, not a white man, but a man. He decided to hold on to the values of his parents and to stand for what he thought was just, for what he thought was right. Following World War II, my father migrated to the West Coast searching for employment, found a job as a cook, a simple cook, at this school called California Maritime Academy in Vallejo, California. Vallejo is a suburb about 27 miles north of San Francisco. And for decades, my father served at school, helping to prepare meals for the midshipmen, the cadets, who were devoting their time in school to prepare for a career in the maritime industry. These would be graduates that would become tugboat pilots and ocean liner captains. These would be workers on oil rigs and oil tankers that would crisscross the globe. Now, in order for these students to graduate from this maritime academy, they had to go on an annual cruise, a 3-month cruise. And my father was a member of the staff, so he had to go right along with these cadets on these cruises every year. My dad, in a 30-year career, sailed the world 10 times over, learned portions of several foreign languages. My dad learned how to conduct himself with every level of persons, and he never wavered from his values. In my 42 years that I knew my dad on this earth, he always stood. You know, friends, I have 4 degrees. My brother is a presidential appointed judge in Washington, D.C., and we weren't the smartest ones in our family. My father, that third grade dropout, taught us many lessons, but for me, the most profound was simply this: son, just stand. I'm recording this series around the day we observe the national holiday commemorating the birthday of civil rights icon Martin Luther King Jr., April 4th, 1968, shortly after 6 o'clock in the evening. King is fatally shot as he stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Hotel, Memphis, Tennessee. Just days following that assassination in 1968, Michigan Congressman John Conyers introduced a bill requesting that King's birthday be declared a national holiday. And on November 2nd, 1983, President Ronald Reagan signed that bill into law, not only establishing King's birthday as a holiday, but forever cementing his legacy as one of the most transformative figures in world history. Martin Luther King Jr. stood. He stood for racial equality and social justice. Listen, friends, one man can make a difference. One woman can make an impact. One man decided to stand. One man, he stood, and his courage influenced a generation. His convictions challenged a divided world. His actions transformed men and women worldwide. I believe that King's life could be summed up in one word: stand. You see, rarely is standing convenient. Rarely is standing popular. Rarely is standing in style or in vogue. In fact, when King came on the scene in Montgomery, 1955, by the way, back in 1955, Montgomery, Alabama, was called the cradle of the Confederacy. When King came on the scene in Montgomery in 55, America was at a racial crossroads, but history would be altered, all because one man challenged many to stand. Often conviction is produced by an exigence, an imperfection marked by urgency. Sexism in exigence, racism in exigence, the mental health crisis of today in exigence. So you see, an exigence can be personal, it can be health related, it can be financial. In the case that Martin Luther King was facing, the exigence was societal. Racial unrest had been building for hundreds of years in America. As a matter of fact, the Atlantic slave trade that started in the 16th century had gone into full swing and really captured those early centuries in American history. America was rural and agrarian, and labor became the justification for slavery. 12 million people, mostly from West Africa, with a couple of million dying en route, came over to the United States. It's important to note that they did not come over as slaves. They came over as proud husbands and wives and chiefs and doctors and tribal leaders. But when they got here, they were enslaved. So the slave labor built the plantation economy based on mostly sugar crops, cotton, tobacco, and coffee. And the effects, devastation for an entire group of people that did not come to America voluntarily. Slavery was just spiritually debilitating. Slavery was established in silence. As a matter of fact, it was characterized as a necessary evil as the claims of colored people were suppressed. However, I mention all that to say, despite the dark days of slavery, despite the dark days of world history, don't you find it fascinating that there have always been men and women who dared to stand? And in the case of the Atlantic slave trade that produced hundreds of years of slavery in America, there were still men and women who stood. They stood. For example, in colonial America, slavery moved from a necessary evil to a positive good, but yet people stood. This was a time when whites would talk to other whites about the role of coloreds. Men would talk to other men about the role of women. The institution of slavery was designed to convince the colored person that it was in their best interest. Yet, people continued to stand. Some coloreds stood, like Nat Turner, like Harriet Tubman. There were also whites that stood, like white abolitionist John Brown, who considered himself an instrument of God, raised to strike a blow against slavery. Or there was Wendell Phillips who stood. Wendell Phillips, a white pastor who was president of the American Anti-Slavery Society. Or there was William Lloyd Garrison, this great journalist who happened to be friends with the great Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist. William Lloyd Garrison risked his life by publishing an anti-slavery newspaper called The Liberator. By the way, Garrison also was a major voice in the women's suffrage movement in the 19th and 20th centuries. What am I saying? I'm saying that there have always been people who have challenged themselves to stand. Despite the exigence of the hour, despite the difficulties, despite the situation. Just take a snapshot of the 20th century as we move into this effort to assimilate, which means bringing blacks and browns and whites and men and women all together to participate in a fuller example of democracy. In the 20th century, we see America attempting efforts to assimilate. We see W.E.B. Du Bois, an educator who pushed for the talented 10th, that perhaps 10% of the Negroes would be worthy to get an education. Booker T. Washington challenged that assumption and said, we ought to have education for all Negroes, and advocated more of a general education at Tuskegee. We had the beginning of the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People that began as the Niagara Convention in 1909. We had Marcus Garvey, who was the head of the United Negro Improvement Association. We had A. Philip Randolph, who was the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. We had a congressman, Adam Clayton Powell, I believe the fourth Black congressman. We had Shirley Chisholm, the first African American congressman. On the baseball field, we had Jackie Robinson. On the golf course, we had Charlie Sifford. In the courtroom, Thurgood Marshall. On the streets, we had Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker and Joanna Robinson. We had jazz music that was exploding. The Negro Baseball League. We had African Americans now in education and medicine and the law. On television, I can remember being a child watching Nat King Cole. We had a president that was bold. Harriet Truman did the unthinkable in 1948 when he issued Executive Order 9981. With one stroke of the pen, the Air Force, along with other branches of service, were integrated. And then the big blow against racism, the big, huge blow against segregation. May 17th, 1954, shortly after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Thurgood Marshall, armed with the 14th Amendment of the Constitution of the United States, argued successfully in a case known as Brown versus the Board of Education. The bottom line, separate but equal, is unconstitutional. And that's where we pick up with Martin King standing on the shoulders of brown, black, white, men, women, people of all ethnicities, people of all political parties, people of all religious traditions. King is standing on the shoulders of all those with courage and conviction that perhaps one day we will live in a beloved community where we will all play together and pray together and grow together and fellowship together and live together in harmony. He said on one occasion, either we're going to learn to dwell together as brothers and sisters, or we're going to perish together as fools. In our next episode, we're going to talk and drill deeply into the rhetoric and the example that Martin Luther King left us as to how we can stand regardless of the difficulty of the hour. That's going to do it for this episode. Until we meet again, this is Dr. Rick, asking the most important question I can ask. How you living?
Are you ready to make an impact in your world right now? Do you want to stop existing and start living your best life right now? Dr. Rick wants to give you the first chapter of his best-selling book, Lessons from a Third Grade Dropout, absolutely free. Just go to www.rickrigsby.com/free gift to get the print or audiobook right now.
This is the podcastfactory.com.